All right. Hello and good evening, everybody. My name is Tessa Picata. I am a junior political science and classics double major, and I am a student coordinator for the McCarthy Center, and we would love to thank you for coming tonight to this interview with Zach Vertin about his new novel, A Rope from the Sky. Not novel. You know what I mean. All right. A Rope from the Sky, the making and unmaking of the world's newest state. Interviewing Zach tonight is Jordan Gemelier. He is an awesome volunteer at the McCarthy Center and a senior, yeah, there we go, and a senior political science major at St. John's University. And of course, we have Zach Vertin here with us tonight. Zach Vertin is a writer, foreign policy analyst, and former U.S. diplomat. As part of his career working in international politics and peace and conflict issues, he spent 8 years working on, living in, and traveling to Sudan and the South Sudan. First as an analyst for the International Crisis Group, and later as chief of staff to the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan during the second Obama administration. He has traveled to South Sudan's furthest reaches, stayed in mud huts on the banks of the Nile, and spoken to everyone, from presidents and generals to cattle keepers, and school teachers. And he's also sat at the peace table as diplomat and negotiator as high-stakes peace talks sought to end South Sudan's civil war. Zach is currently a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution at the Doha Center, and he also teaches at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. He has written and commented for major media outlets in the US and around the globe. He is a native of Minnesota and a 2005 graduate of St. John's University, where he majored in philosophy. And without further ado, Zach Vertin.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me? Thanks, everyone, for coming out. So excited to be home here and fit a stop on this dog and pony show here in St. John's, and particularly happy to see so many people that played a pretty important role in my life, and I hope when I get to the end I'll remember to thank all of you. A lot of professors here. My high school English teacher is here, which is pretty exciting to me, and fortunately this has happened at most stops I've had so far. I was in London a few months ago for one of the first book talks, and I looked out at the crowd and I saw friends from places I'd lived in Europe and in Nairobi and in New York and in Minnesota and all these places, and I thought to myself, you know, I'd never been married. Sorry, my parents are here, sorry about that. I haven't been married, and I looked out at the crowd and I thought, wow, I bet this is what your wedding day is like. And so I started to tell this story, and I got to that part and I said, I'm just so grateful. It really feels like, and I was about to say wedding day, and a friend of mine yelled from the back, your funeral. So anyway, then as now, grateful that you could all come out for this event, however we're calling it. So thank you so much.
All right. Everybody hear me okay? If I'm talking too loud, please raise your arms. I don't want to break your ears. So thank you for being here with us tonight. And so, A Rope from the Sky. So first things first, I presume that there might be a story behind this title. Do you want to share that with us?
Sure. So in the Nilotic folktales of South Sudan, the ancient folktales, the earth and the sky were once linked by a rope. And that meant that the South Sudanese people could travel up and down that rope freely, and they had access to the gods and to the heavens and to eternal life. And sadly, on account of human error, at one point, that rope is tragically severed, and the people are forever resigned to the suffering and difficulty and mortality of the human condition. And in some ways, this book, too, is a story of paradise lost. And so I came across that myth somewhere along the way over 8 or 9 years in South Sudan, and I thought it was bittersweet, well known among many communities in South Sudan, and in some ways fitting for this book.
Okay, well, with that being said, why did you decide to write this book?
Great question. You know, I think Sudan, and I write about this in the opening of the book, Sudan is a faraway place. For most people, it's unrecognizable. It's a faraway place, and yet, for some reason, it registers pretty widely in popular consciousness. Right? Even if you don't know anything about Sudan, people tend to know about the Lost Boys, these young men that escaped Sudan's long civil war and escaped famine and disease and incredible circumstances and came to the United States and settled in towns and cities all across America and across Canada, who have been popularized in books and film. Others know about Darfur and both the war there and the popular activist movement that really captured hearts and minds in this country in the mid-2000s. Other people may just know the two words George Clooney, and that comes to mind when they think of Sudan. I see you, you're out there. And yet, I think many people do not know this extraordinary story, what I think is a really extraordinary story of how Africa's largest state was split in half, right? And I emphasize largest state because my father asked me about this the other night. Just for a bit of orientation, Sudan is, the old Sudan as a whole is roughly speaking, can we get that map up there? The old Sudan, roughly speaking, is about the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. So bigger than most people think. So anyway, most people don't know this extraordinary story that split this country into the long, righteous liberation struggle, the euphoric high of independence 8 years ago in 2011, and the really devastating collapse that happened thereafter. People also aren't very familiar with the extraordinary role played by the United States in the making of South Sudan and midwifing a nation, really. And so I thought long and hard before deciding to write this book, put it off a few times, and I left the Obama administration in 2016, and I asked really close friends and confidants in both countries, in the United States and in South Sudan, for their advice, and was encouraged. And look, I knew I had accidentally been present in South Sudan, both before and during and after independence, and I knew that in some ways I sat astride this unique relationship between the West and South Sudan, and so decided to proceed.
Okay.
Got there just barely.
So it sounds like this is gonna interest a lot of people in many different areas, including U.S. foreign policy. And so before we dive in though, can you give us the basics for those of us that aren't familiar about what happened in Sudan and South Sudan?
Sure.
That brought us to the present day.
I even brought a slide for this. Sweet. Let's hope this. There it is. I'm going to stand up so I can see. So Sudan was amid one of the world's worst civil wars from the mid-'80s to the mid-2000s. Really a devastating war in which millions of lives were lost. In 2005, a peace deal was signed that ended that war. This is a war nominally between North and South. Really, it's between the center and a government in Khartoum in the north that's attempting for generations to govern this huge state, and it really struggles to do so. And along the way, it suppresses and oppresses and denies rights and a voice in government to many of the people in the peripheries of the country, particularly in the south. And so this peace deal ends the North-South war, and there are two governments set up, one in the north and a semi-autonomous government in the south. And this is called the interim period. So for the next 6 years, there's a trial period where South Sudan and Sudan are going to essentially continue dating. And at the end of that period, they're going to decide, will we stay in continued union, or will the South secede and go its own way? In 2011, that happens. And South Sudanese have the chance to vote, and to the tune of 99% of South Sudanese voters chose independence. So that's here. Along the way, as you might imagine, and we can talk more about this later, there's a very complicated divorce between North and South. It turns out splitting a country in two is pretty sticky business. And that meant divvying up oil revenues and figuring out security and figuring out currency and the status of nationals on each side of the border. All sorts of really thorny issues that took the better part of 2 years to untangle. Unfortunately, just 2 years after South Sudan's independence, when there's this moment of great hope and the whole eyes of the world are watching, just 2 years later, war returns to South Sudan. And this is a different war. It's a second civil war, and this is confined inside South Sudan. And lastly here, we'll finish with this, but thereafter, there's several years of, and in some ways, ongoing peace process to try and recapture the hope of liberation and the hope of a new South Sudan. I think that's all we have here. This is South Sudan. Now you're oriented, I think. Experts. All right.
I think that gives us a pretty good outline of it. So in the book, we learn about the outside role played by the United States. And so how did we come to play such a pivotal role in the making of South Sudan?
I'm going to do the short version. The longer version's in the book, I swear. So during the Civil War, there's a liberation movement in South Sudan called the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, and this is the popular resistance movement, an armed resistance movement that is fighting against oppression in the north, and it's led by a guy called Dr. John Garang, who some of you may have heard of. But essentially, at the end of the Cold War, this Marxist-Leninist liberation movement realizes it's on the wrong side of history. And John Garang decides, we got to do something about this. And so he comes to Washington, this rebel warlord from one of the most remote regions of South Sudan. He comes to Washington, and he tries to establish a relationship. And initially, the government, the White House, and the administrations are arm's length. And so he goes knocking on other doors. And this guy has an incredible vision for the future of South Sudan, a really new Sudan, which he's based in large part on learned in large part given his own time in the United States. So John Garang studied agronomy at the University of Iowa, or Iowa State. He also did military college training in Georgia. He'd been to the United States 3 times before, and so he has this sort of cultural curriculum that helps him as he comes to build a constituency of support. And over the next years, and ultimately over the next decade, and in large part on his back, he builds what many would say is an unprecedented coalition of supporters. So he sells religious persecution to the Christian right and gets support from churches all across the Bible Belt, and some of those issues also to congressional Republicans from the South. He sells slavery and human rights abuses to the Congressional Black Caucus. And so he builds this a coalition, this bipartisan coalition in Congress, as well as among churches and advocacy groups and human rights groups outside of government. And the fact that he does this and comes from the wrong side of history and builds this constituency in the United States is nothing short of remarkable. As we learn as we go, unfortunately, it's too associated with a single man, and we'll get to that. But the interesting piece of this is that this constituency is built at what I think or argue is a unique place in American foreign policy, where the human rights-based, principles-based foreign policy meets at this nexus with an almost total lack of national security interest. And so in that space, a handful of people are able to shape policy and build a constituency in a way that would never happen were it a more serious place, were it about China or Russia or Iran. And so ultimately that is based on a certain kind of foreign policy which has its merits, but as we'll see as we go forward, also becomes prone to both oversimplification and some degree of moral certainty, let's say.
Okay. Well, that's a...
So the United States, in short, does a lot over this period that I've outlined for you, both in delivering much-needed humanitarian aid to really struggling people in the South, to ending its war, and ultimately to delivering this golden prize of independence in 2011. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's good. So the book starts off with a pretty substantial prologue, which sort of frames the whole narrative arc. So tell us about your character named Simon, a young man who we meet in the very first pages of the book.
Yeah, so right up front, as you mentioned in the prologue of the book, we meet a young man called Simon. who is from a place called Akobo, which is a village on the eastern part of South Sudan. And Simon was displaced during the long civil war, and he in fact grows up in a refugee camp in neighboring Kenya. He's come back in 2011, excited by the promise of a new beginning, and he becomes a secondary school student, and he's going to finish his studies in Juba, the capital of South Sudan. And we meet Simon on the night the violence begins, December 15th, 2013. And Simon is laying in his hut of sticks and corrugated tin on the north side of town, and he's on his cell phone, and his face is illuminated by its blue glow, and he hears gunfire. And then he hears more gunfire, and he hears it coming closer and closer, and pretty soon gunfire gives way to the thuds of heavy machine guns, and then to tanks and mortar shells. And Simon realizes over the course of the next 24 hours that he won't be going to school this week. And so, a long story short, there are elements of the National Army that are out essentially hunting members of Simon's tribe. Simon is an ethnic Nuer, one of the two main ethnic groups in South Sudan, the Nuer and the Dinka. He's an ethnic Nuer, and as a result of what is spiraling in South Sudan that night, there are essentially death squads out roaming house to house, hunting out not only soldiers from the Nuer community, but women and children and young men like Simon. And so he's forced to make a choice. He's forced to make a choice that so many people had to make that night. And he makes a run for it. He realizes that his neighborhood is next, and he sprints across the north side of Juba, and I won't tell you the whole story, but he encounters extraordinary obstacles along the way. And he comes within inches of his life. And he arrives at the base of the UN peacekeeping mission. So there's a United Nations peacekeeping mission that exists there already in South Sudan, and he runs there to seek refuge. And when he arrives there, this is in the middle of the night on December 16th, 2013, he finds several thousand and then tens of thousands of others like him from across Juba that are already banging on the gates of the United Nations base, seeking refuge, running for their lives. Fortunately, those gates are open, and he makes his way inside, but we'll come back to that. From there, in the prologue, we flash back, right? There's sort of a... Did I do that right? And we flash back 2 years earlier to a very different kind of day. And Simon wakes up on the morning of July the 9th, 2011, and he puts on a new suit. His brother has gifted him a new suit, and he puts on a new tie, and he meets up with his friends, and he boogies his way through the streets of Juba and down to Freedom Square. And Freedom Square is this in the center of the capital, and there he finds hundreds of thousands of citizens in waiting. Other South Sudanese from across the country who have come to celebrate a day, not days or weeks or years in the making, but a day, really generations in the making. And at this moment, the whole world is watching, right? Camera crews and televisions and everybody from around the world, all eyes are trained on South Sudan. And he dances and he shouts out, "South Sudan, oyez!" And there's a response from the crowd, oyez! And there's music played and speeches delivered, and Simon listens to the words of his new leaders, and his expectations swell, right? And so, right in the beginning of the book here, we have the juxtaposition of the kind of highs and lows of this story, the narrative arc. And from there, we rewind. I won't attempt that sound noise. We rewind, and we try to unpack just how the hell we got here.
Well, so like Simon, you have told this story through the lens of a host of different characters. Both Sudan's the big men, as well as the everyman. And so tell us about that decision to write the story in that way.
With characters. They're more interesting than me, I think, and it's their story. This was a new kind of writing to me, and was terribly fun, different kind of writing. And I went back to South Sudan and interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people, some who I'd known for years, others who were completely new to me. And so, as you mentioned, we do meet the big men. We meet President Salva Kiir, who, if you saw him in the photo up here, he's the one with the big black cowboy hat, which was a gift from President George W. Bush. We meet John Garang, the individual I mentioned who developed the special relationship and who's a lionized figure in South Sudan and a charismatic figure. We meet Salva Kiir, the president, who's thrust into the presidency by accident, and the chapter on Salva Kiir is called The Accidental President. We meet another gentleman called Riek Machar, who's the sort of arch nemesis of both of those two individuals and who's an ethnic Nuer. Who's a terribly interesting guy, and the chapter on him follows that one, and it's called Rebel with a PhD. So we meet these figures that have animated South Sudan's story for a long time. Too long, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many South Sudanese. And we'll come back to that. But these are central characters that live throughout the book, but we also meet a host of other South Sudanese who I think are as important to understand this story. We meet a woman called Ayen. Ayen is in her mid-40s, and she was, like Simon, displaced during Sudan's long civil war. Interesting enough, during that civil war, she takes refuge in the north. And in fact, thousands and thousands and millions of Southerners took refuge in the north. And she goes and moves to Khartoum as a young woman and makes a life. And she marries there, and she has multiple children, and she has a job and a community and friends from all over South Sudan, or all over Sudan. But in 2011, like so many others, excited by the promise of a new beginning, she decides to go back. So there's this electric fervor about the opportunity in South Sudan, right? And this is generations. This is what her fathers and her grandfathers and grandmothers fought for generations. And so Ayen sells everything she owns. And she and her husband pack up their 4 kids and 3 other orphan kids, and they get on a bus. And they go south, and they get on another bus. And they go south, and they get on a barge and have a 2-week journey up the Nile to the capital in South Sudan. And she's taking these 7 kids, these 7 South Sudanese kids of ethnic South Sudanese origin, she's taking these kids home to a country they've never set foot in. So we meet Ayen along the way. We meet a guy called James, who's an ex-banker who, after things come undone in South Sudan, he feels free to finally talk about extreme corruption. And so he helps us understand both the scope of that corruption and the motivations for it. We meet a young man called Dwap, who takes us inside a very sacred place in South Sudan, the cattle camp. Cattle are an incredibly important part of South Sudanese society, and Dwap helps us takes us there. So we meet all of these characters along the way, and they show up throughout the book. And I just think it's a more interesting story. The George Bush makes a cameo, President Obama makes a cameo, even the Pope shows up. So there's lots of interesting characters, and I think tells a fuller, richer version of the story. I hope. You can let me know.
Along with telling the story through the characters, you also show up as this narrator, introducing us to this foreign place.
Yeah. In process terms, this was the hardest part of writing the book. And I actually started the book after working on South Sudan and the region for 8 or 9 years. I never intended to show up in the book. I was mortified by the idea of showing up or ever using the word I. This is not my story. And I went to a writing camp up in the mountains in northern New York State in the Catskills, and was sort of a confab with other authors and journalists. And over beers and around a fire one night, they told me I was ridiculous, and that that's not how you tell stories, and that you were there. Why are you trying to remove yourself from the story? And one of them said to me that night that I doesn't have to mean me. And maybe that's evident to some of you that have done this kind of writing, or clear it wasn't to me. And so that was a pretty important learning experience, and it really opened things up for me. So I do show up as a vehicle, as a set of eyes. I hope that it never comes across as about me or my emotional process or any of that, but merely to take you and help you access this really faraway place. And so that really opened up the story for me, and I think there are stories, some crazy stories from these times in South Sudan, both as a diplomat and otherwise traveling to, and ending up accidentally on this huge campus of this oil fields in the middle of the night one time in South Sudan, flying in the first days of the war. There are a lot of personal stories showing up and flying in and going to the market in South Sudan for my first time. That I hope I use as a way to try and animate and highlight some of the larger themes of the book. And I think it's a more accessible way, or I hope it's a more accessible way to get there. So that's a great question. It was a very difficult decision, and I actually wrote 5 or 6 chapters without that ever using the word I, and sort of it grew on me from there.
One example is a scene where you're playing basketball with some young hotshots. Do you want to go into that one?
No. Yeah, so that's another story. Another way that many people in the general audience first accessed or know about South Sudan is through basketball. So I felt really old mentioning some of these names today to students, but currently for the Minnesota Timberwolves, there's a guy called Luol Deng, who is one of South Sudan's favorite sons. And Luol Deng and some others that came before him are really important figures in South Sudan, and I'll come back to that. But there are scenes of me playing basketball, and when I tried to go out and get exercise in Juba, I would go to various courts, sometimes to the military headquarters, and there were army generals playing, and they had their personal guards walking up and down with AK-47s. Made you think twice before committing a hard foul. But I ended up playing on occasion with a bunch of 16 and 17-year-olds. And look, I played for Breckenridge High School, and I had some very basic fundamentals, and I could not jump. And my diminishing abilities were comically juxtaposed with these young teenagers from across South Sudan who, simply speaking, could sky. So it was great fun, and the coach really he was very generous, saying that, it's nice for his kids who had no formal training. They'd come from all over South Sudan, never seen a basketball court, to play with those of you that had good fundamentals. So I took that feather in my cap. But basketball, I think, is one interesting example of something larger in South Sudan. So all of those kids on that court that day, and I played with them a bunch of times, but they all knew Luol Deng. They all knew his stats. They all knew the teams he had played for. They all knew his Olympic status. They all knew how many points he scored in the All-Star game. And none of them cared about his ethnicity. And none of them cared about his background or his connections or what state he was from. And these are some of the issues that have so shredded South Sudanese society, both in the first civil war and in this early turbulent attempt to get off the ground in 2011. And you just see it among these young kids. All the rest of this stuff starts, that colors so much of society just start to fall away. And Luol Deng and these people are treated like kings upon their return, and they've accessed something larger. And I think there are these things like basketball that speak to South Sudan's future, I think.
Can you tell us about South Sudan and on the day of independence and the challenges that it existed then?
So at independence in 2011, think of the most underdeveloped place you can imagine, and then multiply. When I arrived in South Sudan in early 2009, a country itself, South Sudan, about the size of France, there were 50 kilometers of paved road in the whole country. So this is a place that has no governing institutions, has been deliberately underdeveloped for generations. It's got no institutions. It has to build a national identity among this society that's so torn by war. And at the same time, just as it's starting to get off the ground and all hands on deck are needed, it's still undergoing this very complicated divorce proceedings with Khartoum, and the return to war is very real. So all that to say, the challenge is enormous. South Sudan had two things going for it. One, an enormous reservoir of international goodwill, enormous. Driven in large part by the United States, but also by the region and many countries around the globe who had seen this example of self-determination and really a success, widely touted as a US foreign policy success and celebrated around the world. Two, it had oil money. So I won't won't bore you with the history of oil because we'd be here until tomorrow. But they had oil in South Sudan. Not forever, but they had oil money that most states in Africa would kill for. And so in some sense, that's the ticket to a viable state in South Sudan. So the opportunity is there, and the hope is there, and the excitement is there, but the challenge is unprecedented.
So these revered liberation fighters in South Sudan, the SPLM, rather than living up to democratic ideals for which they fought for, we instead are seeing them rig elections, suppress dissent, and they're cracking down on any of their fellow Southern Sudanese people who object to them. Why? Why do you think they failed?
So as I mentioned, the SPLM is the liberation movement that fights for one of the liberation movements, one of the fighting forces in South Sudan that fights for independence, and upon independence assumes the role as governors of the state. And this book, in addition to the narrative and the stories, is one part political autopsy. And for me, an appropriate political autopsy doesn't begin in 2013, on the night of the violence. It doesn't begin at Independence Day in 2011. It doesn't even begin in 2005 when the war ends. It begins much earlier in the 1980s and the 1990s. And so I go back to South Sudan and sit down for hours and hours and hours with a lot of the men at the top of the SPLM. And unfortunately, they are mostly men. And revisit the SPLM and its highs and its lows and its failure in a new light. And some of these issues are gaining greater context and maturing with time. And so I sit down with them, and I won't go into it all now here, but there are sort of, if I can remember them, 3 answers that I preview in the book. One is the ethos of the movement that John Garang built. So despite his legendary charisma and his vision for change and reform in Sudan, which was captivating and really won over all those people, John Garang was not building a democratic movement in South Sudan. He had perhaps overlearned the lessons of failed liberation movements gone before, and he held that movement with an iron fist. And it meant that they could build democratic structures, and they could build hospitals and schools and deliver institutions later. That was his thinking. And I'm sorry to give you a spoiler alert here, but John Garang tragically dies unexpectedly. And in many ways, the SPLM and that vision dies with him, right? Because he's not built this up. So the ethos of the movement that John Garang built is something I think requires further inspection. Related to that, number 2 on this political autopsy is a lack of a meaningful connection with ordinary South Sudanese people. So I won't nerd out on you entirely, but if you look elsewhere in the region and elsewhere in the world, particularly these kind of movements historically are at best the ones that are delivering food to their people, that are providing services, that are protecting these people. In some cases, are building schools or are building clinics or providing healthcare in very dire circumstances. That's true even of movements in the region. It wasn't true of the SPLM. And too often, the SPLM was preying on its own people. And that was not known in the United States. It just simply wasn't known, and those that did know it basically chose to ignore it or kick it down the road because there was a larger goal in the near term. And I can understand that rationale, but it meant that there wasn't a meaningful connection with the people, and in many ways, many in the West saw South Sudan and the SPLM as synonymous. And in many ways, there were huge constituencies in South Sudan that wanted nothing to do with the SPLM. And the roots of the current civil war are contained in that last sentence, in my view. So the third is, I always forget the third, Department of Energy. No, what is that? No, party factionalism. Party factionalism. There are some Rick Perry fans here, I can tell. So the third preview of this political autopsy is party factionalism. So in the wake of John Garang's death, at this time when all hands on deck are needed, a power struggle begins inside the SPLM, inside the ruling party, inside an elite class of 30, 50, 80, 100 guys. And they are vying for control of the movement. And that's largely unseen to the outside, and it ends up being deeply corrosive at this moment of such importance for South Sudan. And when independence is achieved, suddenly those cracks begin to emerge. And it's a power struggle that ignites the civil war in 2013. In my humble opinion, it's not ethnicity. It's not at its origins an ethnic war. It's a war about power.
In this context, there's also some notable criticism of the U.S. and other Western governments in the book, and for kind of an uncritical embrace of the ruling party, the SPLM. So, what did we get wrong?
Yeah. So a good chunk of the book, a sub-theme that runs throughout the book, is the role of the United States. And I'll reiterate what I said before, that role was critical in saving lives and in ending the war and in delivering South Sudan this extraordinary opportunity. But I think also, along the way, the posture and the approach of the U.S. and some Western partners also helps sow the seeds of what happens. And this is summed up for me in the quote. There's an epigraph that opens chapter 22. That after years of this really special relationship between South Sudan and the United States, the chapter is called Love Lost. And so I sat down with one of South Sudan's most ardent champions who had helped develop this relationship over all these years. And he says, very poignantly, you know, you can become close to someone, but still be a tough friend. And we were never a tough friend. And I think that really sums it up for me. And so over time, I argue in the book that a simplified narrative about South Sudan's war, or about Sudan's war, an unqualified belief in the righteousness of the cause, and a compulsion to act, all that in a place that isn't taken as seriously as some other regions of the world, help contribute to this uncritical embrace, and ultimately means the United States gets, in my view, too close to the SPLM. Does that sum it up? We can come back to that. I know that's usually a hot topic in Q&A, so we'll talk more about that.
There's also a chapter called Waldorf Astoria, and this takes place in 2011, just after independence. And we start to see things changing between South Sudan and America, and it stands out a bit in a fascinating story about President Obama. Can you summarize that story for us?
No.
No?
No, but I can tell it to you. So there's this chapter in the middle of the book called Waldorf Astoria. And if any of this isn't clear on the U.S. relationship, it's complicated. So stand up and throw something at me and I'll try to unpack it a bit more. But Salva Kiir, the man in the big black cowboy hat, has met George W. Bush in the Oval Office 3 times when he's head of a country that doesn't yet exist. There aren't that many heads of state that get that kind of access in Washington, right? And so he's met George Bush and developed this important relationship, and he's never met President Barack Obama, though. And he didn't, and it's the Obama administration that ultimately oversees and safeguards independence in 2011. And so he's looking forward to meeting Obama. And Salva Kiir hops on a plane and arrives in New York, in Midtown East, where the famed Waldorf Astoria hotel is. And every September, historically, the United States would essentially take over the Waldorf Astoria and make it its own State Department during the UN General Assembly meetings in New York. And so there's a meeting on one of the upper floors scheduled, and it's late in the afternoon, and the sun sets over the Manhattan skyscrapers, and Salva Kiir goes up the elevator to meet Obama. And I'll give you a little bit of context here. South Sudan has just become independent. They've been fighting for generations against oppressive governments in the north. They weren't the only ones fighting. Others inside Sudan and what's left in the main part of Sudan are still fighting against that government. And nobody in the south, Salva Kiir and the others, want to hang these guys out to dry. They've got independence in the south, but their brothers in arms are left behind. And so they are sending weapons across the border. And this is now an international border. And this comes in the middle of that very complicated divorce, and it is hugely dangerous. And so Obama has proof of this. I can tell you, I was in Sudan at the time. It was the worst kept secret in the region. Everyone knew it was happening. Khartoum knew it was happening. But it's hugely dangerous. And so Obama has satellite imagery, proof that this is happening, and he's going to raise it with Salva Kiir. And so the American diplomats, in advance of that meeting, meet with their South Sudanese counterparts on several occasions and say, don't lie to the president. Whatever you do, don't lie to President Obama. We understand this. I'm paraphrasing. We understand this issue. We can work it out. We understand your motivation. We can get to the bottom of this together, but please do not lie to the president. Pregnant pause. You know where this is going. So they go into the room and they shake hands and exchange pleasantries, and they take seats, the two delegations on each side of a table, and the flags are behind them, and there's mostly pleasantries exchanged, and they talk about the future and continued cooperation, and it's all very nice. And at the end of the meeting, Obama comes to the one substantive issue, and he says, Mr. President Kiir, we understand you're sending weapons across the border, and we've got proof of it. And we understand it, but it's got to stop. You're a sovereign country now, and this is too risky. And basically confronts the issue. And there is, just like tonight, a pregnant pause. And all eyes in the room turn on Salva Kiir, and his cowboy hat is looking down. And there's a long pause, and he waits and waits and waits, and he looks up and he looks at President Obama and says, Mr. President, if your satellites are telling you we're sending weapons across the border, you should probably check on your satellites. Needless to say, the meeting ends very quickly. Obama has no more love for these guys, and I use it in the book because I think it's really a sign of when the relationship starts to tangibly change. And this is right after independence. 6 weeks after independence. So the SPLM in Southern Sudan needed the United States to deliver all these things it couldn't: an end to the war, a right to a referendum vote, and raising the flag on Independence Day. And that is when the United States had leverage and was at this critical point, and the relationship starts to change pretty quickly. And Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who was in that meeting and who was among those that recounted it, was one of America's most decorated diplomats of his generation. And he appears on the first page. This book is dedicated to Ambassador Lyman, who passed away this year. But he says at that moment, we nearly fell off our chairs. And he says, I think it's when people started to see, and Obama certainly saw, that there had been, interests had been mistaken for friendships. And I think it shows the danger of a sort of emotional attachment in foreign policy, and the kind of posture and the kind of catalyst or the reasons that gave rise to this special relationship. And so things really start to change there. It's a great scene. It's in more detail in the book.
So I want to turn to part 3 of the book, which kind of zooms in and takes a close look at the 2-year peace process to try to end the war. And this begins with you flying into Juba, and as an American diplomat in the opening days of the war. And Can you take us back to that moment?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the war in South Sudan begins in December 2013, just before Christmas. I am then the policy director or chief of staff to the U.S. Special Envoy, who's responsible for American policy making and diplomacy on behalf of both the White House and the State Department, kind of a super diplomat. And this violence began. There's allegations of a coup d'etat, that this guy Riek Machar was going to overthrow Salva Kiir, the president, and long story short, things unwind pretty quickly from there. We leave the State Department, go home and pack a 3-day bag. In fact, inside that bag were Christmas presents for these two people sitting right here, my parents, because we were going to fly to Juba and then fly straight back, and I was going to come to MSP Airport and fly right past St. John's on my way home to Breckenridge for Christmas. And we fly to Germany and to Kenya and then into South Sudan, into the capital, Juba. And we are whisked in bulletproof diplomatic vehicles straight to the office of the president, and we go inside and we bring a message from Washington, backed by this history and this special relationship that this has to stop. And we use carrots and sticks, and we do everything we can to try and urge Salva Kiir to not let this go over the edge. And at this time, it's just a few days in. And so there isn't a civil war. Really, nobody has any idea how bad it is already, including us. And so we address this issue. We try to push him to get on the phone with Riek Machar. We try to push him to the peace table. And we deliver the message. And we get back on a plane that night, I think. And we fly back out to neighboring Kenya, which is the first kind of pit stop outside of South Sudan. And we're in Nairobi airport, and everyone in the world is watching. All of the news media outlets that just 2 years before had come to celebrate this day are now splashing images of human carnage and violence across the televisions, or around that time. And we take our 3-day bags and in Nairobi airport, and we get on the jetway to walk down to the plane to come back home. And we get a call on our cell phone, and it's John Kerry, the Secretary of State, our boss, and he says, go back. So at this time, he's in the White House Situation Room, and more intelligence reporting is flowing in that's revealing just how bad it is, that it's much worse than anybody thinks, and that's deteriorating fast. And so we're not coming home. So we turn around and fly back into Juba, to begin a shuttle diplomacy that takes us all over the region, Kenya, Uganda, Egypt, Ethiopia, trying to piece together a peace process to get these guys to the negotiating table before the promise of South Sudan is lost. And we had left with our 3-day bags, and we got home 9 weeks later. So I threw away those socks, don't worry. But that was the start of the peace process, and it happened in neighboring Ethiopia, and the stakes were high, right? This was a chance to salvage this sort of shards of a shattered dream and recapture this hope, and when we set up a peace process over the next 2 years to try and end the violence first and try to institute a host of major reforms in all sectors of society. Long story short, I think that peace process probably helped things from being worse in South Sudan, but that was a matter of degrees because things were very bad. And we can talk about it more. I go into a bit of detail in the book because in some sense we fail. And the region is in charge of mediating that peace process. The Americans are not in charge. We're sort of playing behind the scenes and supporting from behind the scenes, and I'm working kind of night and day and late into 1, 2 o'clock in the morning in the hotel with the chief mediator, who's the former Ethiopian foreign minister, and we do our best to try and bring other South Sudanese voices into the process. These are guys with guns who want to carve up the cake themselves, and we were trying to work with a broader section of South Sudanese society to bring them into a multi-stakeholder, inclusive peace process. And after months and months and months of putting that together and advancing, long story short, it's ultimately narrowed back to a power game between the two factions and the two leaders, and it doesn't last as a result. So there's I think, 2 chapters in the book about that, not because I'm certain that that moment will stand the test of time in 50 or 100 years, but I think because through that peace process and through the people you meet and through the dynamics there, you can understand a lot about South Sudan, past, present, and future.
You write that after the war began and its devastating images were broadcast around the world, that a larger question ultimately rose to the surface. Did South Sudan's collapse mean independence was a mistake? Tell us about your conclusion to that question.
The billion-dollar question. Did all this mean, did this undoing mean that South Sudan's independence was a mistake? No. My conclusion is no, and here are my reasons. Well, let me say that this question came fast and hot after things came undone in South Sudan, and I think there was a lot of gotcha journalism that pointed at the United States and pointed elsewhere and see your pet project has gone belly up and wasn't it so obvious? And no, the criticism in this book is about having leaned on the scales and moved on too soon, and what we all, myself included, can learn from this. And this is why I think it's about, hopefully, a book that's about more than South Sudan. It's about, we're not very good at learning lessons, and we're not very good at particularly at taking Africa seriously, and I think there are things to learn for how we think about these issues and how we posture, whether it's in Yemen or Syria or the next crisis. So I think that gotcha journalism was unfair or unwarranted or cheap, and I think it missed 2 points. One is the context, and that is, had the South Sudanese been denied their right to self-determination, had they been not denied that vote that their sons and daughters had fought for generations in 2011, I am of the firm belief, and most of the people I know believe, that a new and larger war between North and South would have ensued. And that war is now fueled by oil money. And oil money means much, much bigger weapons. And I think most would argue that a new and larger war would very, very well could have ensued and could have engulfed the whole region. And it would have been much worse. So that's first, and that's in the immediate term. If you zoom out, part B of the answer is about the right or the principle of self-determination. And this had been enshrined in the UN Charter since 1945, and if you look around the world and you look around modern history, it's hard to find a place that has as strong a case as South Sudan for a people that have been denied a right to determine their own political destiny, right? I've laid out how underdeveloped it was. I've laid out a history of slavery between Northerners taking Southerners for a slave, a history of war, a history of denial and repression. So in that larger sense, I think while it was very tenuous and the task ahead was enormous, I think it was absolutely right that the South Sudanese got to decide. So I don't think independence was a mistake. I think the more credible explanations or critiques are about expectations and execution. And I think there's a lot to be learned from this period, this 6-year period. 6 years. How much gets done today in a session of Congress? Not that much, right? Imagine these people trying to create a nation from scratch in the space of 6 years, at the same time that they have a hostile neighbor from the north. So I think there is some lessons to be learned about asking these guys to implement a liberal state in a box in the space of 6 years. There are political reasons why that happened, and surely, the fate of South Sudan belongs to Southern Sudanese, and that's not a cliche. I mean that, but I do think there are places where a hard look in the mirror is required, and this is one of them. I don't think independence was a mistake. I think there are discussions and arguments to be had about execution and about expectations.
So that brings me around to my final question about what I thought was the most interesting thing about this book. So things in South Sudan, it all seems pretty grim lately, and with the numbers of dead reportedly as high as 400,000 in a recent study, and there's been so much suffering. And yet you end this book on a note of optimism. Why is that?
Yeah, I think it depends on your time horizon. Right, I think it's gonna be hard for quite some time, but I think it depends on your time horizon. And I have this conversation often. I think I even reference it in the opening author note of the book. But a lot has changed, and South Sudan had the benefit of modernity, and it had the benefit of outside support and the advancement of global norms, and it squandered this opportunity. But it wasn't that long ago that my own country, our own country, fought its own civil war to the tune of 750,000 deaths over identity, economy, and the nature of our state. And in that sense, I just think that's a useful historical perspective, in that surely there was a lot that went wrong in the immediate term, but the expectation that the South Sudanese were going to simply leapfrog the difficulties and the challenge and the violence that allowed for the formation of states in much of the rest of the world was unrealistic. So I think it depends on your time horizon, one, and two, this is the last chapter of the book, and it's about a young man named Kong. And Kong is the reason I have optimism, and I end the book with a note of hope and optimism. And it's the most personal chapter, and I think, at least as I wrote it or write it, it's the one I'm most proud of. So I met Kong, who's roughly my age, on my first visit to South Sudan. And I traveled way out to where he lives in a faraway place, and I met someone who said, "You gotta meet this guy." And I went and I sat with him one night, and I had talked to dozens and dozens of people about South Sudan. And Kong, he was in his late 20s at the time, has more interesting, more thoughtful, more developed ideas about social reconciliation and about building institutions and about what he can do in his community and at a state level and at a national level, and he's remarkable. And we're sitting there late into the night drinking sodas, and it gets dark, and I'm slapping the mosquitoes on my legs, but I don't want to go home because I want to keep listening to Kong. And he's a remarkable guy. And I left, and 7 years went by, and I kept tabs on Kong. I hadn't talked to him, but I kept tabs on him. And he had ascended in his community to the role of county commissioner, and people had high hopes for Kong. And so in 2016, when I went to write this book, I flew back to South Sudan and hopped on an airplane to Bor and hopped on another helicopter to further into one of South Sudan's biggest states, and then another helicopter, and I got to a place called Wat, which is in the heart of the Nuer community in one of the most remote regions in this huge swamp in the middle of South Sudan. And Kong is there, and he's a leader in his community. And he is embroiled, despite his best attempts, he too, like everyone else, is embroiled in the messy divisions and polarization of the war. But we sit there over the next 2 days, and God, is it convenient for me to fly in for 2 days and talk to this guy and then leave. I attach a great deal of responsibility to that chapter as a result. And I sit with Kong, and he's talking about the same issues, and he's got just as exciting ideas, but he's hitting the ceiling because there's only so much he can do with it, because the guys at the top are still there. And in that, I think one of the most important ingredients in South Sudan's success and its future is generational change. There are things we can do in the short term to help and to partner with South Sudan and to try to make the most of what's happening now, but I really think that South Sudan's uptick in its story will come with generational change. And Kong is like many people across South Sudan, and I've met a bunch of them, guys and young women in their 30s and early 40s and 20s who spent, like Simon, a lot of their youths outside of South Sudan, which gave them a silver lining in two ways. It meant they got an education they never would have gotten at home, and it meant they grew up in refugee camps in Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia alongside members of South Sudan's entire ethnic spectrum. There are 60-some ethnicities in South Sudan, and they didn't grow up in isolated villages away from these people. They grew up and made friends with all of these people, and And so they think differently and they talk differently, and they have a different idea about the future in South Sudan. And Kong is faced with a very tough choice because the ceiling is still there, and he and I wrestle in the last chapter with this. Does he go and leave and say, to hell with this, you know, I've seen this movie before, I'm gonna go back to the elsewhere in the neighborhood and bring my family and I'll work and I'll come back when these guys are gone? Or does he stay? Does he stay and does he try to make a difference? Does he do what he can at his local community level? And Kong in many ways is a really bright guy, and he's got a group of young men around him who are loyal to a fault. But these aren't the kind of issues that Kong feels like he can bounce off with them or be a sounding board. And so we do that over the next 2 days. And you know, who am I to say? At the time, of course, I want Kong to stay. I would never impose that on him, but we talk about the pros and cons. And Kong wants to get in touch with other young people from across South Sudan, these people that he knew growing up, and the divisions of the war are making that hard. But Kong and his friends and others like him, I think, are the reason I have hope about South Sudan in the long term.
Right, well, thank you very much. Good to have you back on campus.
Yeah, so at this time, we can take a few questions from the audience. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring a mic over to you.
Everyone still awake? Barely? Do you want to pick people?
Sure.
Oh, you got it, sorry.
That's okay.
Thanks, everybody,
Thank
for
you.
coming, by the way.
In the beginning, you talk about Simon fleeing for his life because a ethnic war is breaking out between the Nuer and the Dinka. To what degree is that animosity between those tribes exist today in the South Sudan?
Yeah. Do you mind, can I stand up and walk around so I can see people? I get antsy sitting there. It exists. And I mentioned, and good catch, because I didn't clarify this, but South Sudanese society is shredded during the long civil war. And a lot of that war, even though it was nominally between North and South, oftentimes is fought between Southerners. And the North gets very good at dividing and conquering and turning South Sudanese communities against each other. So there is this long history of violence that exists. And it's just starting to heal in 2011. But the glue that had held South Sudan together up to that point was one thing: opposition to the North and a desire to independence. Beyond that, there wasn't that much that held people together. What did it mean to be South Sudanese, right? People still identify first not as South Sudanese, but as Dinka or Aniwak or Shilluk or Nuer, right? And so it existed, and it was very delicate, and there were attempts to try and mend that social fabric. And when this power struggle between the guys at the top starts, that breaks down, and they call on the sort of ghosts of these ethnic divisions past, and they rip that fabric wide open again. And so it's an elite political war that turns into an ethnic war pretty quickly. And one thing I meant to say about this elite in South Sudan is that because of that relationship John Garang had established and his lieutenants then carried forward, particularly in Washington, but elsewhere in the West, this elite becomes increasingly accountable, not to their own people, but to a constituency of foreigners that is too willing to back them at any price. And that is part of, I think, the mistake or the lesson learned, and which is hugely applicable to other countries I think we're facing right now and other things going forward. Sorry, you got two answers to your question.
The other side is the religious war between the North and the South. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yes, it wasn't a religious war. It wasn't a religious war in my view. Yeah, despite what Nick Kristof told you, don't trust him. Sorry, provocative. Part of the problem and part of the narrative about Sudan's war was that this was absolutely there are religious elements to it, absolutely. And there's huge divisions, there's racial elements, and there's religious elements, absolutely, first and foremost. But it's not only about that, and in many ways I'd argue it wasn't even primarily about that, right? But the narrative in the West is this is big bad Muslims on horseback against nice young black Christians on foot, right? more complicated. So that's absolutely an element, and it's an essential element to understanding it. If you attempt to understand it only through that lens, we will fail. Sorry to the Christoph fans.
Hey, Zach, this is an important book, and I learned a lot, but I love your writing. And that's a compliment to your mother and father and Mr. Hahnemann.
Wow, friendly crowd. You guys want to come on the road? What are you guys doing next week?
These are I loved your phrase, north of 7 foot, some entrepreneurial security guard deposited us in a room. School was a week's walk.
Wow, you did your homework.
And a decade seems to slip away with each passing mile. I loved it. You're a great writer. But would you read us something from the book that you like?
Okay.
Or that you thought was
Sure.
profound?
I've got, yeah, okay.
At some point.
Should I take some more questions first and then do
Yeah.
that, or what do you? Are there other questions? Let's do a couple more questions and then maybe I'll end with a passage. How's that? Okay. If I can keep people awake, we'll do just a few more questions and then I'll read a little bit.
I don't know if this is on, but St. Cloud has a population of Southern Sudanese.
Right.
And I know one person who has been trying to get her mother out.
Yeah.
And is that possible? I mean, what is the likelihood of being able to get a family member out of South Sudan, given even the current climate in the country regarding,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm going to disappoint you because I don't like to talk about things I don't know about. And I just don't know the answer to that. Certainly, given the number of families that are in places in Minneapolis and St. Cloud, in Omaha, and other places in Virginia, South Sudanese communities, they probably have a leg up on other places. I wouldn't pretend to understand the complexity, and I worked at the State Department. So I don't know that. I can maybe try to find you an email of somebody who might be able to give you a better answer on that. Not impossible, but difficult.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, and
Go ahead.
someone going first? Or? Okay. So you said that we could kind of learn some lessons from kind of what happened with South Sudan. How would you say that kind of what we learned from this situation could be applied to like Kurdistan, to like what's happening in Venezuela right now? What maybe can we take from this that we could apply to those situations?
You have to buy the book. I'm just kidding. Look, this is the second hardest piece about writing the book was, other than using the word was how to do lessons learned. And I was reluctant to sort of get to the end and pack them all up for you. Because, and I say it in the book, I viewed the South Sudan as a political analyst, assessing developments with the benefit of critical distance. I viewed it as a policymaker, trying to choose the least worst option and do everything in our power to make it work. And I viewed it as a lens of a historian or author or reflector after. And I can report after those 8 years that there is no neatly wrapped box of lessons learned. That said, my hope is that they're woven throughout. And I try to leave a lot of that to the reader to figure out themselves. There are some absolutely specific things about getting too close to these guys, about investing too heavily in individuals, about the timing of some of these things. I mean, I do dive into these. I won't go so much into the weeds here, but there are some of these things, I think, in the epilogue in particular that we can all benefit from and I think are probably transferable with some context. There's this 6-year period in which South Sudan has to either choose to make unity attractive with the North and continue as part of this, or decide to go south. And the reality was that shortly after 2005, the jury was out. They were going to leave, and yet they had to play this charade where they try to make unity attractive and try to make this work for most of that period. So the vote for independence, stay or go, is in January of 2011. And it's only in early February when they get the answer to that. And that means they have between February and July to become a state. right? So they had this period in which they could build up a semi-autonomous government and they could do some of these things, but they really couldn't do all of it. And so in some ways, I mean, in hindsight, and with the benefit and the hindsight and all the caveats associated with that, these guys had 5 months to, so there are questions there. I think if you look back, can we structure these things as we partner with states like this? Can we structure these things with a longer time horizon in mind? We're not very good at that. We're not very good at that given our political cycles. Renee's been holding his hand up for a while. Can I call on that young man? Wow. How the tables have turned, my friend. Wait a second, I just want to savor this for a minute.
What I wanted to ask about is really the role of Khartoum and the government of Sudan since 2013, and the role of the president there and all of those aspects of him being a war criminal.
The aspect of what, sorry?
Of him being, the president being a war criminal.
Yeah. And just what that means?
No, I mean, what effect this has on,
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So after that, Khartoum takes a huge blow, having lost half of its territory and having lost most of its oil revenue. And so the National Congress Party, which has had a grip on power for a generation and came to power in 1989, is very much threatened and has to close ranks and has to develop alternative sources of revenue and barely holds on. And it's been barely holding on ever since. President Bashir, as a result of the war in Darfur in the mid-2000s, was later indicted by the International Criminal Court. For those of you that find this issue interesting, there's a whole chapter called Saving Darfur, which it's in quotes because I take a bit of objection with the idea of Westerners saving Darfur. But as a result of that war, President Omar al-Bashir is indicted by the International Criminal Court, but because there's no mechanism to enforce that and because much of the world has backed off on the International Criminal Court, he remains in power today. Although if you're watching the news right now, it's pretty dicey at the moment. So President Bashir remains in power. There's a very rigorous and important and heated debate that started around the International Criminal Court indictment and continues today. And this, right, is the tension between peace and justice that we confront in every one of these situations. And you will have people argue very convincingly for justice and that this is important and that the criminal indictment is what is important and that will set a precedent for other governments and other dictators elsewhere in the world. And you have those on the peace side who say, actually, the International Criminal Court indictment is the only reason that President Bashir is still there, and that he's afraid of leaving because for those of you that remember Charles Taylor, who left and was indicted, he was then picked up, and we saw the result. So people learned the lesson. And so in some ways, I think there's a real argument to be made that the International Criminal Court indictment is the reason that Bashir is still there, and it's the reason that political change of some kind hasn't begun in Khartoum. And that indictment comes on the back of the advocacy movement that did so much to bring attention to this and did important work in probably stopping what was happening there and in ending that. But I hope that I'm very delicate in this chapter, but I think it's a really important one because people across the United States got very involved in the Save Darfur movement, like they got very involved in Kony 2012, like they're able to get involved in other things. And it's important, but harnessing to me, harnessing the power of popular advocacy is something we need to take very seriously because it has its downsides, in my view. Obviously, the intent is right. Obviously, it's important. Sudan's a prime case where the people that were driving that advocacy movement, in my view, had a very particular view about what the outcome should be in Sudan, and I think that was dangerous, and it was broadcast to a whole bunch of people that wanted to make a difference and wanted to be a part of something, but weren't in position to be able to judge those policy choices on their merits.
Wonderful. We'll end with one last question here.
I'm just curious about if you plan to have continuing relationship with South Sudan, or like what's on your horizon?
I don't know. Just I don't know. I kind of think that the book was an attempt to make a small, modest contribution and move on, but you get attached to different places, so it's been very exciting traveling around and we don't have any here tonight, I don't think, but there's been a lot of diaspora that have come out to the talks and participated, and that's been really rewarding and exciting to have this exchange with them. And so I thought I'd kind of left it behind already, but I think there's value in renewal as well. So I was starting to sound like a broken record on some of this stuff. So I now work at the Brookings Institution out of their center in the Middle East. So I sort of live in Doha some of the time. And I'm working on a new area that involves the Gulf states, these hugely rich Gulf states, and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are projecting much greater influence into the Horn of Africa, into North Africa, and into the Red Sea. And it's kind of an emerging theater of rivalry, and I think there's huge opportunities for development and political integration, and for both sides, countries on both sides of the region, but there are also extraordinary risks.
I know that was the last question, but I get to ask the really last question.
Okay, Judy wants me to read a bit, so I don't want to bore these people.
A little bit about Princeton Lyman, given that the book is dedicated.
It was, yeah, I'll tell one quick story. Princeton Lyman was an extraordinary diplomat and mentor of mine, and a hilarious guy who's, I'll get this wrong, but his parents were Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who moved to Los Angeles, and he and his brothers learned how to cook the books at their neighborhood grocery store growing up. This is a story that was told at his funeral this year. But Princeton becomes U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria and to South Africa. He was working hand in hand with a guy called Nelson Mandela during the transition. He's an extraordinary diplomat. I met his predecessor when I was in South Sudan as an analyst for International Crisis Group. I met his predecessor, and a meeting was scheduled for me in Washington with one of his predecessors, who shall remain nameless, and the meeting was scheduled for 40 minutes. And I had just come from a very remote region of South Sudan where there was some violence bubbling and there were some important dynamics happening, and so his staff set up this meeting for me. And the meeting was 40 minutes, and this gentleman talked for 41 of those minutes. Princeton Lyman took over not that long later, and he was this already cherished diplomat, and I was 29. And I met him in Juba for the first time, and we sat down for the meeting, and Princeton pulled out his notebook and licked his pencil and said, "What do you think I need to know?" And I was totally taken with the guy. I mean, it showed such security and such experience by comparison. So an extraordinary guy who is interviewed in this book and shows up in this book and was a big supporter of this book, and sadly passed away before he could read it. But he's on the front page. So I've kept you a long time. I think we're gonna do some book signings if anybody wants, and please come up and we'll chat a little bit more. I'll try to do a quick reading if people aren't totally bored already. Okay. Is there can I use this microphone up here, or is that on? Well, I haven't done any readings before, so we'll see how this goes. Okay, so this is about a character. This is one of the character sketches of a guy that you meet in the book, and there's quite a lot of dialogue with him, and who is 3 times the South Sudanese foreign minister, and straddles the kind of special relationship between South Sudan and the United States. His name is Deng Alor. Deng Alor is a striking figure. Standing 6 foot 8 inches tall, he is a gentle giant, and his slender frame glides with the grace of a giraffe. With a personality and hushed tones to match, he might aptly be branded the Big Smooth. Deng is comfortable in suits and smart ties, though his flashy watch also complements short-sleeved shirts in dark blues, grays, and African prints. Unlike some of his SPLM colleagues, the two-time foreign minister and senior party man neither nor is predisposed to dominate a conversation. At rest, Deng can be still, quiet, and measured. With eyes sometimes only open a slit, it's easy to think that he succumbed to a narcoleptic interlude. Deng speaks in a smooth, milky timbre, infusing more volume and rhythm when a topic animates him. I have seen Deng frustrated on rare occasions, but I have never seen him angry. When greeting a foreign delegation, Deng endears himself by shaking hands, making eye contact, and showing interest in the lowly note-taker as well as the big shot with the fancy title. He is polished, but not detached. His warmth is natural, not practiced. Deng has a remarkable memory for recounting dialogue and regales foreigners with stories of political intrigue, reenacting scenes from lavish dinners at Gaddafi's palaces and backroom horse trading on state visits to China. He is a captivating storyteller, both apocryphal and otherwise. Deng also loves to laugh. After dropping a subtle gag into the end of a story, sly and knowing eye contact follows. He pauses to let it sink in, and then punctuates the silence with a crack of boisterous laughter. Joking with Deng, I can attest, is a physical experience. He laughs from the shoulders, and his punchlines are accompanied by backslaps and high fives. The lanky diplomat can be persuasive, and he knows it. Sidling up to a counterpart, understanding his interests and motivations, and speaking his language, Deng was always well suited to the art of foreign affairs. Throughout the years of struggle, he became particularly skilled in connecting with those from the United States and Europe, understanding the value of these relationships. Is that me? Understanding the value of these relationships for his cause and for himself. Deng is an effective emissary, bordering on manipulative, but he takes care not to cross a line. His efforts to advance an interest are never rooted in malevolence. When seasoned observers call him on his tactics, Deng concedes with laughter, acknowledging the game rather than losing someone's confidence. He is decidedly likable, a fact which can both endear him to foreigners and blind them to larger and more inconvenient truths. Like many of his cohort, Deng is a man between worlds. Born, quote, around 1951, in a disputed border territory called Abyei, his homeland has long been a tempestuous microcosm of the larger struggle between Sudan's north and south, racked by divisive battles over race, culture, boundaries, resources, and nationality. Deng's years and his identity have thus been divided between north and south, as well as between Ethiopia, America, and the political capitals of Africa. He belongs to each of them, and also to none of them. Roughly the size of Connecticut, Abyei, his home, is small and generally unremarkable, but like Kashmir or Gaza, its history as an epicenter of territorial conflict could fill volumes. Settled by Deng's Nok Dinka tribe, the area is also traversed by Arab herders from Sudan, whose centuries-old roots to dry season water sources in the south are an existential matter. Abyei gained national significance when oil was found there in 1979, a discovery which renewed a fight over whether it should be part of North or South. But after multiple promises of a right to decide their own future went unfulfilled, the Nok Dinka people remain in a kind of stateless purgatory. Like Deng, they are at once a part of both worlds and part of neither. Deng attended primary school in Sudan, in Muglad and Wad Madani, before moving on to college and student political activism at the University of Cairo in neighboring Egypt. He made friends with Arabs from Sudan's privileged riverine tribes, more than a few of whom rose to Khartoum's premier political class. Orphaned by the age of 14, the bright teenagers spent holidays and school breaks at their homes, developing lasting ties to their families and embracing Sudanese Arab social mores. Years later, after decades of violence and political acrimony between North and South, he paid the school fees and helped to secure jobs for the children of one boyhood friend, a Northerner active in the reviled National Congress Party government. Another prominent Sudanese politician, Ahmed Haroum, was indicted in 2007, like Bashir, on war crimes charges by the International Criminal Court. Haroun was an architect of the Darfur War and before that he mobilized ruthless militias who targeted and displaced southern civilians, including in Deng's home during the 1990s. He was governor of the Sudanese state that claimed and twice invaded Abyei, once burning Deng's home to the ground. But Deng bought him shoes anyway. Haroon was born with a foot ailment that required specialized shoes, which, due to his international indictment, he could not travel abroad to purchase. After trips to Europe as a government minister, Deng several times returned with a pair of special shoes for Haroon, his peer, neighbor, and foe. Deng's relationship reflected a unique capacity among northern and southern Sudanese to compartmentalize, separating gracious social interaction from often hostile political affairs and divergent worldviews. This is Sudanese culture, Deng says, which is something very strange, something unique to be studied, the psychology of the Sudanese. Before rounds of the no-holds-barred negotiations over separation in 2010 and 11, opposing teams from Khartoum and Juba would first engage in the warm and extended social greetings that are a mainstay of Sudanese social life. Conversing in Arabic, exchanging repeated well wishes, and asking about one another's families, the rivals laughed and embraced while Western diplomats looked on, totally befuddled. Deng is a widely recognized figure in both Sudans and has for years traded on his seniority and reputation among national and international elites. In a nation where hundreds of thousands bear the most common name, Deng is first among Dengs. When one refers simply to Deng, there is no doubt about whom they are speaking. Quote, "I consider myself a Pan-Africanist and a very liberal person," Deng says, a worldview he says is a result of extensive travel, his foreign wife, and early readings in world history and the American Civil Rights Movement. John Garang, who you heard about, introduced him to civil rights era America and its diversity. Its concepts, he says, were at the core of Garang's political philosophy. Quote, "We can build another United States here in Sudan," he had told them. This whole new Sudan thing, this is Garang's idea, Deng says, was born of his experience in America. And so Deng, too, was turned on to an America he had not yet visited, but one that would soon become his second home. I'm almost done. With a Washington Rolodex that would impress any aspiring lobbyist, Deng was long the standard bearer of the American South Sudanese friendship. He hosted Susan Rice on her first trip to SPLA-liberated areas in the 1990s. Chuckling, he recalls Rice, quote, "dancing with Dinka ladies and jumping over bulls they had sacrificed in honor of her visit." I'll skip this part. In addition to befriending legions of humanitarian activists over the ensuing decades, Deng has worked with 3 American presidents, their national security advisors, secretaries of state, and all 7 American special envoys, not to mention Congressman Frank Wolf and the SPLM's bipartisan champions in Congress. His extensive travels make for a similar record of engagement across Europe and Africa. It is a record not lost on political opponents who see Deng and others like him as drawing their legitimacy not from domestic constituencies, but from their ties to the American foreign policy establishment. Last page. Deng is married to a charming Ethiopian woman named Mesrak, with whom he has 3 sons. Mesrak and their boys acquired refugee status in 2001 and relocated to Sacramento, California. Sporting fashionable gear and a casual demeanor, their sons are unmistakably Californian. Each was educated in a local Catholic school and later pursued degrees at West Coast universities. As is the case for many of the SPLM elite, rumors of corruption have followed Deng for years. In the years before independence, many took notice of his redecorated home and office in Juba, expensive shoes and the fleet of SUVs, accoutrements enjoyed across the top tier of Juba's ruling class. But no one was particularly interested in digging into such allegations. The Americans, too, harbored doubts about the personal checkbooks of the SPLM vanguard, but this was an allied region, struggling to escape Islamist tyranny. And in case you forgot, Deng is just so darn likable. The Big Smooth enjoyed personal and professional relationship that spanned tribe, religion, nationality, ideology, and profession. His credibility was in part due to his personality and partly to his position of privilege. He moved as easily in Islamic and Arabic-speaking circles in the north as he did in Pan-African confabs across East and Southern Africa. He took tea with Arab despots in the Middle East, macchiatos with diplomats in Europe, and soda with evangelical Christians in America. And like few others, he bridged ethnic and regional divides across the SPLM, enjoying rapport with both its intellectuals and its military men. Deng's is a life divided, best understood in dichotomy, North and South, Arab and African, local and national, African and American.
Deng is a guerrilla and a cabinet minister, a member of Albier's village elders, and a class of international jet-setting elite. I'll end with that.